Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a question so vast, so ridiculously immense that even uttering it might just stretch your tired little brain a tiny bit. We're going to tackle something utterly impossible yet strangely foundational to understanding ancient Rome, how ancient Romans counted the grains of sand. Yes, you heard that right. Sand. As in every single shimmering speck on every sun-baked beach, every dune cresting against the Saharan winds, every granule grinding between your toes at the Mediterranean shore. The very idea makes your eyes glaze over, doesn't it? It sounds like the most boring history lesson ever conceived, a mathematical torture chamber designed to put even insomniacs to sleep. In fact, you probably won't survive this whole story awake. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you're doing that, maybe just type your location and local time into the comments. It's always fun to see how far our little history sleep club reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You might be lying there cozy under your covers, picturing yourself on a pristine beach. The rhythmic shush of waves, the distant cries of gulls, the scent of salt carried on the breeze. But now zoom in. Focus on a single grain of sand. Imagine picking it up. Now pick up another, and another. Soon you have a small pinch. Then a handful, a bucket, an entire cubic meter of sand sitting there unassuming yet containing a number of grains so astronomical, it actually starts to break your brain a little. For context, 1 cubic meter of sand can hold billions, possibly even trillions of grains depending on the specific type and packing density. To put that into perspective, the sheer quantity of digital photos and videos uploaded to the internet in a single day barely scratches the surface of this kind of immensity. The numbers quickly become so ridiculously large that our modern calculators choke, our eyes glaze over, and our minds wander off to think about what to have for breakfast tomorrow. Now imagine asking a Roman, a guy who spent his days wearing a toga negotiating trade, perhaps conquering a province or simply arguing about the price of olives at the market, to count all the grains of sand. He'd probably just stare at you, blink slowly, maybe offer you a cup of undiluted wine to clear your head, because what in the name of Jupiter is wrong with you? This isn't just about the sheer number, it's about a way of thinking, a cognitive leap that wasn't strictly necessary for everyday Roman life. Romans were incredibly practical. They built colossal aqueducts stretching for miles, delivering fresh water to bustling cities like Rome. They constructed roads that are still frankly embarrassing to our modern infrastructure, connecting an empire that sprawled across 3 continents. They managed armies of hundreds of thousands, supplied them, fed them, clothed them, marched them. Their accounting methods, their taxation systems, their legions' supply lines were marvels of ancient administration. You could even say they were the world's first major logistical powerhouse, the Amazon Prime of antiquity, if Amazon Prime also came with centurions and gladiatorial combat. But did they ever need to express the number of atoms in a cubic inch of lead, or the number of stars in the sky? Not really. Their world, while vast by their standards, had boundaries, definable resources, and a practical limit to the numbers they truly needed to quantify. They counted citizens for the census, they counted tax revenue in sestertii, they counted soldiers in legions, they counted sacks of grain to feed the masses, they counted votes in the Senate, though sometimes those numbers were flexible. However, the idea of counting sand wasn't entirely foreign to the ancient world. It pops up in literature and philosophy as a metaphor for the truly uncountable. The Greeks, as you might recall, were a bit more theoretically inclined than the Romans, and they often wrestled with concepts of infinity and immeasurable quantities. There was one particularly clever fellow, Archimedes, who centuries before the Romans fully hit their stride wrote a treatise called The Sand Reckoner, where he did estimate the number of grains of sand it would take to fill the entire known universe. He didn't just shrug and say, "a lot." He actually developed a system for expressing enormously large numbers, essentially inventing a precursor to logarithmic notation. He's our outlier here, the guy who brings a supercomputer to a counting with your fingers contest. Romans, generally speaking, weren't quite so obsessed with abstract theoretical gymnastics of that magnitude. Their pragmatism often took precedence. They cared about how many bricks to build a new public bathhouse, not how many hypothetical bathhouses would fit into the cosmic void. Mainstream historical fact alert: the Romans, with their highly organized and practical approach to empire management, extensively used the census, originating from the Latin censere, meaning to estimate or to rate to register citizens, assess taxes, and determine military obligations. This process required a remarkable degree of numeracy and record-keeping on a grand scale far beyond what many other contemporary civilizations managed. Yet even with these extensive records, precise population numbers across the vast Roman Empire at any given time are still debated, and historians still argue whether their methods truly captured the full breadth of the population, or if there were significant undercounts, especially in remote or recently conquered areas. A quirky tidbit, perhaps related to the mundane, is that Roman accountants or clerks, often slaves or freedmen, used calculi small stones on an abacus or counting board, or meticulously scratched marks onto waxed tablets. Imagine tallying millions of denarii with little pebbles. You'd lose your marbles, or rather your calculi, very quickly. My brain aches just thinking about the scale of the paperwork. Maybe that's why they eventually preferred stone monuments for permanent records. Less chance of accidentally spilling your census figures over your morning lentils. And that, dear listeners, is where the sand begins to feel less like a poetic metaphor and more like a headache-inducing administrative problem. Your weary eyes might still be tracing phantom calculi on the abacus board, feeling the smooth, cold surface as you slide the tiny pebbles, trying to compute Rome's annual tax yield. But while the Roman citizen, soldier, or merchant primarily focused on the numbers immediately pertinent to their lives, a handful of denarii for bread, a legion of soldiers for a campaign, a few hundred slaves for a villa, the concept of unimaginably large numbers wasn't entirely absent from the ancient mind, it just presented itself differently. It wasn't about empirical counting of specific physical objects like individual sand grains, but rather a more poetic, even mystical appreciation for scale. Imagine yourself staring up at the clear Roman night sky, perhaps outside the city where the stars unmarred by light pollution would be breathtaking. Each one a pinpoint of light multiplied countless times across the vast celestial sphere. You didn't count them, you felt their immensity. You knew intrinsically that they were legion beyond human enumeration. The human brain, even millennia ago, possessed an innate ability to grasp that something was a lot, even if it lacked the precise mathematical tools to define how much a lot was. Think of ancient mythologies and epic poems. Heroes faced armies as numerous as the leaves on the trees, or the sands of the shore, or the waves of the sea. These were not meant to be literal quantities you could stick in a spreadsheet. They were literary devices designed to convey insurmountable odds, incredible wealth, or infinite creation. When a Roman orator wanted to emphasize the overwhelming gratitude of the people, he might exclaim it was as vast as the universe, not that it could be measured in cubic paces of thankfulness. These rhetorical flourishes allowed them to deal with quantities far beyond the scope of their written numbers. It's like when you're utterly exhausted and someone asks how you are and you say, "I'm 1,000,000 miles from awake." You don't actually mean you've flown 1,000,000 miles. You mean you're really tired. It's just shorthand for an extreme quantity. For most of ancient history across different civilizations, numbering systems weren't built for cosmic calculations. They were tools for inventory, trade administration, and basic engineering. If you needed to record how many amphorae of olive oil were in the warehouse, your system was adequate. If you needed to track how many soldiers were in the army, it worked. If you needed to divvy up an inheritance among numerous heirs, you could do it. But push those systems beyond the practical, beyond the human scale, and they creaked and groaned. Even something as seemingly simple as expressing 1,000,000 was a relatively recent abstraction for many ancient systems requiring multiple repetitions of symbols or cumbersome additive processes. Try writing 1,000,000 in traditional Roman numerals and you'll find yourself needing either an impossibly long scroll or resorting to modifications that are effectively non-standard. Wait, what are we up to? Has anyone got a spare M? We're going to need a lot of miss. You might even laugh to yourself picturing a Roman scribe desperately trying to chisel MCMXCIX on a stone tablet for 1,999, then imagining trying to fit something with 10 times the letters on there for a larger number. It's the ancient world's version of trying to open a gigantic Excel file on a floppy disk. While Roman ingenuity certainly focused on the concrete and pragmatic, the idea of theoretical big numbers was in fairness explored by some Greek thinkers. We touched on Archimedes in the previous section. His sand reckoner wasn't merely a parlor trick, it was a profound mathematical innovation. He created a system that could name numbers far exceeding any used in everyday life, or even the theoretical number of grains of sand in the universe, using a technique analogous to powers of 10. He started with the concept of an octet 8 units, not to be confused with our modern octet or group of 8. His first numbers went up to 10 circumflex 8. Then his first numbers of the second order were multiples of 10 circumflex 8 circumflex 8, and so on, reaching truly cosmic scales. This shows a deep fascination with numbers, not for practical use, but for pushing the boundaries of mathematical thought. While this was largely a Greek preoccupation, particularly with luminaries like Pythagoras, who infused numbers with spiritual significance, Romans weren't entirely ignorant of these ideas. Many educated Romans were fluent in Greek, admired Greek philosophy, and even traveled to Athens to study. However, for a Roman senator, hearing about Archimedes calculating universal sand grains might have elicited an appreciative nod followed by, "Interesting. But can it win us another legion against the Gauls?" Mainstream historical fact-time ancient societies often had specific symbols or words for large denominations, but the concept of zero as a placeholder, or a number in its own right, was largely absent in many ancient systems, including the Roman one. The Hindu-Arabic numeral system, with its positional notation and the ingenious invention of zero, revolutionized our ability to handle vast numbers efficiently. Without it, performing multiplication and division of large numbers became incredibly laborious, often requiring an abacus for even relatively small sums. The absence of a robust zero meant that how ancient Romans counted the grains of sand was computationally impossible using their native numbering system alone. They couldn't even perform calculations of such scale in theory with it, let alone practically. A quirky tidbit that underlines this difficulty: the Romans primarily used additive and subtractive principles with a relatively limited set of symbols, IV, X, L, C, D, M. To represent a truly enormous number like hundreds of millions or billions, they sometimes resorted to methods beyond the basic IV, X, L, C, D, M. For instance, putting a bar over a numeral, for example V, meant multiplying it by 1000, allowing for M for 10000000 to become a V with a bar. And for a truly colossal amount, they might use multiple bars. This wasn't a universal standard and hints at the struggle to cope with truly mind-boggling sums, demonstrating a "let's just add more lines" approach to number expression. It's like if you had to write a very large number in a spreadsheet, you just started writing very, very, very. It works, but it's not efficient. And for the how many sand grains problem, it would essentially break their ability to represent the sheer scale. Historians still argue whether the limited scope of Roman numerals, particularly for extremely large numbers, fundamentally hampered advanced mathematical theoretical development compared to civilizations that developed more flexible and efficient systems, or if it simply reflects their dominant pragmatic worldview, where such extreme numerical abstraction wasn't a pressing imperial need. Either way, you can imagine some bored Roman scribes late at night trying to extend those little bars over letters, getting lost and thinking, "By Jupiter, maybe just a lot will suffice on this ledger." This deep dive into the limitations and the theoretical reaches of ancient numerical thinking only sets the stage for our next step, getting back to the practical realities of what Roman numerals could do. Your mind might be picturing that weary scribe eyes bloodshot from extending bars over numerals, and you're probably thankful you can just punch in 10000000000000000 into a calculator and let a silicon chip do all the hard work. But let's zoom in from the cosmic scale of theoretical sand counting and ground ourselves in the brass tacks reality of how the average Roman actually used numbers. Forget the billions and trillions for a moment. Let's understand the everyday language of Roman quantities. What were Roman numerals, and why did they stick around for so long, influencing everything from clock faces to Super Bowl designations? You already know them, even if just dimly from school or that intimidating first chapter of a history textbook. We're talking about IV, X, L, C, D, and M. Simple symbols, elegant in their way, derived not from abstract mathematical concepts, but probably from practical systems of counting. Think of tally marks, 1 stick for 1, 2 sticks for 2, and then perhaps a cross-out for 5, like making tally marks to keep score in a very low-stakes ancient board game. The I is just a single stroke, 2, 3, that's just more strokes. Then you hit V, which might have originally been an open hand, or perhaps a mark from which 4 tally sticks stemmed, indicating 5. then an X, two V's mashed together representing 10. It's wonderfully intuitive for small quantities, allowing you to quickly sum things up like counting chickens in the marketplace or votes in the Senate. A group of X's followed by a V and a couple of I's was easily recognizable. If you've ever had to keep track of a few dozen something or others, the idea of having distinct symbols for groups 5, 10, 50 helps prevent losing count after reaching your third stick. So let's break it down gently, letting the numerical rhythm lull you. I is 1, V is 5, X is 10, L is 50, C, which stands for centum, is 100, D, which looks a bit like half of a millennium sign, more on that in a moment, is 500, and M for Milla is 1000. Easy enough, right? The basic rule is addition. If a symbol of lesser value appears after a symbol of greater value, you add them. So VixX is 5 plus 1 equals 6. CLX is 100 plus 50 plus 10 equals 160. MMCCLX would be 3000 plus 300 plus 50 plus 10 plus 5 plus 1 equals 3367. Say that out loud, it feels a bit clunky, doesn't it? Like assembling IKEA furniture with too many screws. But it worked. For millennia. But there's a sneaky little twist that makes it feel less like pure addition, the subtraction rule. If a symbol of lesser value appears before a symbol of greater value, you subtract it. So IV is 5 minus 1 equals 4, not 6. XL is 50 minus 10 equals 40. XC is 100 minus 10 equals 90. CD is 500 minus 100 equals 400. CM is 1000 minus 100 equals 900. This clever little shortcut, developed probably during the Middle Ages or even later than purely Roman times, helped keep numbers more concise. Can you imagine IV written as 3, clunky, messy, and prone to miscounting a few too many strokes? The IV form is cleaner, more compact, and probably saved Roman sign makers a lot of carving time. You just wonder who was the brave genius who first said, "Hey, why don't we try putting the I before the V sometimes?" I bet that caused quite a stir among the scribes and tax collectors. You're changing tradition, Quintus. Typical applications for these numbers were everywhere you looked in Rome. You'd see them on milestones marking distances along the vast road network, Roma Clex Ix MP, 169 Roman miles from Rome. You'd find them on inscriptions on triumphal arches documenting the year of construction, the names of victorious generals, and the spoils of war. Imperator Caesar Divi, Filius Augustus. MDCC3 might adorn a public monument if you wanted to commemorate something very, very old. That last number I just gave you, 1893, is an actual example illustrating how long these numerals lasted, influencing European thought and official numbering well into modern times, particularly for dates. They'd appear on laws, public decrees, gladiatorial arena seating plans, and the prices scratched into marketplace stalls. Roman merchants certainly weren't dealing with thousands of chickens, they were dealing with a few dozens, and keeping a tally was quick. How many jars of fish sauce? Oh, 33 of the good stuff. Mainstream historical fact. While Roman numerals might seem less advanced than our positional decimal system, their primary use wasn't for complex arithmetic, but for recording and notating quantities. Calculations were almost exclusively performed using tools like the abacus, which functioned perfectly well irrespective of the chosen numerical notation system. You could be performing complex additions or subtractions with pebbles on an abacus, and then simply writing down the final sum using the familiar Roman symbols. The numerals themselves were largely a labeling system rather than a computational one, unlike our Arabic numerals, which are inherently built for calculation through place value. It's the difference between using a post-it note to remember a grocery list versus doing quantum physics on a supercomputer. Both use numbers, but one is fundamentally different from the other. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates this limited computational utility division was notoriously difficult using Roman numerals alone. Try dividing XLV 45 by 99 without converting to Arabic numbers in your head. It's like trying to untangle a ball of yarn while wearing mittens and a blindfold. There's a reason ancient mathematics textbooks are filled with instructions for the abacus, not endless exercises in symbolic manipulation of I's and V's. You could be staring at MDCX Liv 1644 for days and still not easily divide it by 3. But a Roman mathematician or accountant using an abacus would simply punch in 1644 divide by 3 and get 548 DXLV8 quite rapidly, then write it down. Historians still argue whether the dominance of physical calculation tools like the abacus stifled the development of abstract written mathematics in ancient Rome, or if their practical needs simply didn't necessitate the evolution of a more algebraically friendly numerical system. Some scholars contend that their practical achievements in engineering and administration show their mastery of applied math, while others suggest a theoretical deficiency compared to their Greek predecessors. It's a bit like debating whether driving a car requires knowing how to build one. They used the tool for what it was designed for very effectively, but for counting all the sand on all the beaches in the world, these lovely little letters and their charming addition-subtraction rules are about as useful as a chocolate teapot or trying to measure the volume of an ocean with a teaspoon. We need to remember this as we approach truly enormous numbers. The traditional Roman system simply doesn't scale without resorting to clunky modifications or abandoning notation altogether. And so the concept of a number like a million becomes a challenge, and a billion an outright impossibility without our next exploration. You're perhaps starting to appreciate how simply counting up to 10 was quite enough for most Roman needs, or maybe a few hundred for an inventory. Your own thoughts hopefully are gently slowing down a little, like watching honey slowly pour. But what happens when the numbers escalate beyond the manageable quantities of a dozen amphorae of wine or a few legions of soldiers? We briefly touched on the awkwardness of trying to write numbers in the thousands in the last section, but it bears lingering on. The very structure of Roman numerals which we learned relied on repetition and addition eventually hits a wall. A wall made of well numbers that just keep repeating until your fingers cramp. Think of it this way. Your largest single symbol is M for 1000. So to write 3000 you need MM, no problem. But what about 30000? You'd have to write MMM 10 times. No, not really, but it illustrates the core issue. The Roman numeral system in its basic, unaugmented form really wasn't designed to go much beyond the thousands. The largest number you can write using just IVXLCDM and observing the subtraction rules is 3999 MMCMXCIX. Beyond that, things get incredibly clunky or require special notation not always universally understood or consistently applied. You can practically hear the ancient scribe sighing as he contemplates etching out thousands of M's on his papyrus scroll, knowing that if he makes one slip-up, it's going to be a long day of unrolling and re-rolling. Quintus, did you count every M or just give up around the 3,000 mark because the Imperial Revenue Office takes this very seriously, you know? The fundamental problem is the lack of place value. In our decimal system, the number 222 has a very different meaning for each 2, depending on its position, 200s, 210s, 2 units. This makes writing truly enormous numbers concise. With Roman numerals, an M always means 1000. To signify 1 million, you need something new. This was a challenge not unique to Rome. Many ancient numeral systems grappled with expressing very large numbers. While the Mayans, for example, had a sophisticated base 20 system with a zero concept, it was generally an exception rather than the norm across the globe. To cope with larger sums beyond 3999, the Romans, or rather later Europeans applying the Roman system, sometimes resorted to modifications. The most common was the vinculum, a bar placed over a numeral. A single bar multiplied the value by 1000. So VV with a bar over it suddenly jumped from 5 to 5000. X became 10,000. C became 100,000. And the mighty M, our beloved 1000, if you slapped a bar over it, theoretically became 100,000,001 million. If you wanted to really get crazy, some systems occasionally used a double bar for a factor of a million, for example M for a billion, though this was extremely rare and non-standardized. Can you imagine trying to chisel that precisely on a stone inscription without chipping off an entire zero from your newly created billion? This kind of notation allowed for expressing numbers up to a few billion, but it was largely an ad hoc development rather than an intrinsic part of the classical Roman system, and its usage wasn't always consistent across the sprawling empire. It feels a bit like bolting rocket boosters onto a donkey cart. You're trying to get to the moon, but you're still relying on an animal pulling you. Another archaic and even more arcane way, they sometimes depicted larger numbers before the common M for 1000, or the later use of the vinculum was using apostrophous symbols, or what some call C signs. This was a system that evolved from Etruscan numerals, often involving half-C shapes or circles with various lines. For instance, CIO or CID often represented 1000, which evolved into M. CCIDO might have represented 10000 and CCSIDO a whopping 100,000. Imagine explaining that to someone just learning to count apples in the marketplace. It was confusing even for them. It's no wonder M stuck around as the universal symbol for 1000. It's simply less prone to getting lost in the visual clutter. These early, more complex forms show the Roman struggle for efficiently representing really big numbers, and also their willingness to borrow and adapt or sometimes discard systems that just didn't work for their needs. And the counting sand grains problem would demand a notation that would span continents in length if these archaic systems were the only ones available. This system, with all its additions and potential modifications, still lacks the elegance and efficiency of our decimal system, which allows us to write truly gigantic numbers that we would actually use for something like counting grains of sand, even theoretically. The Roman method was good for summing taxes for a province, perhaps estimating grain stockpiles for the year, but not for philosophical cosmic calculations. A census of millions of people could be recorded in their system, yes, but performing intricate demographic analyses that required multiplications or divisions with those huge numbers would be a Herculean task without an abacus and modern computational principles. This makes it challenging to perform operations beyond simple addition or subtraction directly with the written numerals. Imagine trying to multiply Cartridge 3 by XLX directly in your head, or on paper using only Roman numerals. It's not intuitive, it's not efficient, and it's why a Roman calculating genius probably just smiled, reached for his abacus and said, "Hold my wine, plebeian, I've got this." Mainstream historical fact time. While the vinculum was a clever later innovation to extend the Roman numeral system, classical Roman numerals themselves did not possess a formal concept of thousands multipliers or a positional system. Numbers like 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 therefore could not be directly or conveniently expressed in the original notation. The Romans understood thousands of thousands, but writing it was a different challenge altogether, fundamentally distinguishing their numerical recording from, say, later Arabic or even Babylonian cuneiform systems, which possessed much larger counting bases. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this difficulty: a common historical error arises when trying to interpret inscriptions from antiquity or the medieval period. Because the use of the vinculum, the bar, or other super-large notations was inconsistent, scholars sometimes have to heavily infer the exact values, especially if the symbol is faded or chipped. It means that something that looks like 10000000M might have simply been an elaborate way to write 1000 for a very important occasion, or conversely, what looks like just M was actually part of a larger lost sequence of numbers, adding another layer of delightful numerical detective work. Historians still argue whether the adoption and standardization of alternative numbering systems by medieval European scholars, such as Hindu-Arabic numerals, was driven by an inherent inadequacy of Roman numerals for emerging scientific and commercial needs, or if it was more a consequence of cultural exchange and the increasing interconnectedness of global knowledge. While Romans achieved incredible feats without positional notation, the mental burden for complex calculations involving truly vast sums like the grains of sand thought experiment was certainly present. You just wonder how many scribes pulled out their hair contemplating this particular problem, only to decide to just go for a soothing dip in the public baths. Their numbering system was practical for the day-to-day, but not built for cosmic speculation. So now that we know what they couldn't do with their numbers, let's consider what kind of large quantities they did grapple with, even if they couldn't write the final number in the traditional way on a postage stamp. So you've settled into a comfortable rhythm with those peculiar Roman letters and their fascinating, if somewhat restrictive, dance of addition and subtraction. You've likely realized that even with clever tricks like the vinculum that bar over a number, remember turning a mere M into a majestic M, they couldn't quite express a true grains of sand number without resorting to an absurd amount of pen strokes or chisel marks. Yet the Romans absolutely had to grapple with colossal quantities every single day. Their empire wasn't built on quaint market transactions involving a handful of coins and a dozen fish. This was an entity that spanned an entire known world, stretching from the chill mists of Britain to the scorching sands of Egypt. Quantifying its resources, its people, its military might, that wasn't an academic exercise. It was the lifeblood of their entire civilization, Imagine for a moment being a Roman provincial governor, perhaps overseeing the collection of taxes from the fertile plains of Gaul. You aren't just counting individual gold coins. You are receiving wagon loads of grain, barrels of olive oil, thousands of animal hides, hundreds of tons of ore, and millions upon millions of sestertii. Or picture a military general preparing for a campaign against Parthia. You need to know not just how many legions are under your command, easily countable with X and M, but how many days' rations are required for them. How many chariots, how many spare arrows, how many pieces of equipment. This involves estimating volumes, weights, and logistics on a scale that would make modern supply chain managers lose their perfectly organized minds. They were dealing with truckloads before trucks existed. How many oxen for how many carts for how many tons of wheat for how many legions of men marching how many hundreds of miles for how many weeks. My brain just articulating that starts to short-circuit. It was a massive undertaking, and it all relied on practical estimations of scale. The most obvious, perhaps even the most intimate massive number for any Roman citizen, was the population. The Roman census, which we touched on before, was a recurring and vital part of imperial administration. It wasn't just about knowing how many people lived in Rome or even a specific province. It was about knowing how many eligible male citizens there were for military service, how many property owners could be taxed, and what the overall demographic spread was like. Every 5 years, the censor's high-ranking magistrates undertook the formidable task of registering every citizen, their property, and their families. This involved armies of clerks fanning out across the empire, recording details, assessing values. Imagine having to fill out a detailed census form for your entire family, property by property, and then doing it all by hand on a wax tablet, or perhaps a rough papyrus scroll, and knowing that your individual data was just one of millions of similar entries flowing back to Rome. It makes filling out your online tax forms look like a stroll in the park. One quirky Roman detail is that during the census, people often declared their capita or heads, but the true counting method could sometimes involve declaring livestock and assets, making the term a little confusing by modern standards where head count just means humans. It could have meant heads of cattle too. Then there was the sheer economic engine of the empire. Rome itself, the capital, consumed vast quantities of goods, importing grain from Egypt and North Africa, timber from distant forests, metal ores from mines scattered across the continent, exotic spices and luxury items from far-off lands like India and China. How did they quantify these incredible flows of material wealth? Ships arriving daily in ports like Ostia would unload hundreds, if not thousands, of tons of foodstuffs. Grain elevators and warehouses had to be built on an enormous scale to cope. These weren't counted kernel by kernel, thank the gods. Instead, Romans would rely on measurements like the modius, a unit of dry measure roughly 8.75 liters, or the amphora, a ceramic jar roughly 26 liters typically used for wine or oil. They measured things in bulk by the cartload, by the shipful, or by the volume of a warehouse. It's the difference between counting individual beads and knowing how many bags of beads you have. You didn't need to calculate the exact number of olives in an entire season's harvest from Sicily to know how much tax was owed, but rather how many amphorae filled up the ship. If you asked a Roman merchant how many individual olives were in his largest shipment, he'd probably laugh, take a deep drink, and invite you to try and count them yourself. It was an abstract and unnecessary detail. Military strength also stretched the numerical capabilities of Rome. The legions, famously the backbone of Roman power, consisted of around 6,000 men. But Rome rarely operated with just one or two. At its peak, the Roman Empire might field between 28 and 33 legions, meaning the total active military force, including auxiliaries, who often numbered more than the legions themselves, could easily swell into the hundreds of thousands, nearing 500,000 active personnel, especially during major wars. Managing logistics for such an immense fighting force was a numerical nightmare, a test of organizational genius. Provisions, weaponry, clothing, medical supplies, everything had to be accounted for, ordered, tracked, and delivered across thousands of miles. Again, while you didn't need to count every rivet on every soldier's shield, you absolutely needed to know how many shields to order or how many bushels of grain would sustain them for a week-long march. This practical counting, however large the numbers became, still felt manageable, because it was based on concrete, tangible units. Mainstream historical fact. The sheer logistical feat of provisioning the city of Rome, which by the peak of the empire might have boasted a population of over 1 million people, relied on a meticulously managed grain supply, the annona. This operation required the import, storage, and distribution of colossal amounts of grain, effectively meaning they needed to quantify millions of measures of produce annually. This sophisticated administrative network demonstrates the Romans' capacity to handle truly massive numbers through a combination of standardized weights and measures, organized infrastructure like granaries, and detailed record-keeping. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to their immense organizational efforts is the existence of the Digest of Justinian, a massive compilation of Roman law produced centuries after the Republic's heyday. It alone runs to 50 books comprising some 3 million lines of text with roughly 45 million words. Our full script is still but a small fraction of that. It's a testament not just to the volume of Roman legal output, but to their incredible administrative efforts to codify and store this information for generations, often with painstaking detail about economic transactions, property rights, and inheritance. Imagine the number of scribes who had to painstakingly copy and recopy these vast legal texts. I'm thinking they ran out of fresh papyrus at least once a day, and maybe accidentally scribbled the name of a distant relative into a crucial property law. Oops! Guess Uncle Marcus just inherited a public bathhouse, my mistake. Historians still argue whether the apparent meticulousness of Roman record-keeping from the census to military records was consistently maintained across all provinces and over long periods, or if significant portions of these numerical estimates were subject to approximations, deliberate underreporting for tax evasion, or simple decay and loss over centuries. Was their grasp of immense numbers truly comprehensive? Or were they masters of the elegant statistical fudge? While we marvel at the precision evident in their structures and laws, the vastness of the empire and the primitive nature of their communication and storage technologies make complete accuracy of any huge number an almost mythological aspiration. And as your eyes start to feel heavy, maybe you're starting to understand that even an entire empire with its millions of people and mountains of grain feels quaint compared to the infinite nature of a single beach. Our next step takes us deeper into the tools they used for the counting they could do. Your imagination has perhaps been whisking you around the Roman Empire from tax collecting in Gaul to marshalling grain in Egypt, and it might seem as if they performed all these feats of logistical magic simply with a furrowed brow and an innate sense of scale. But of course they had tools. Ancient tools, certainly not the blinking lights of our calculators or the swift strokes of a spreadsheet. The humble yet remarkably effective Roman abacus was the workhorse of Roman numerical computation. Forget visions of complex calculations etched in long strings of Roman numerals. Those letters were for recording, not for crunching numbers. The actual crunching happened with Pebble's fingers, and perhaps the faint click-clack sound that would be utterly un-ASMR-like for bedtime stories, but was the sweet sound of commerce for the Romans. So picture this. You're a Roman merchant haggling over a shipment of olive oil. The seller names his price a hefty sum. You need to calculate the total cost, perhaps with a slight discount for bulk. You pull out your personal abacus. It wasn't the kind of wooden frame with colorful beads you might remember from primary school, designed for tiny hands to learn basic counting. Roman abacuses were often bronze plates about the size of a modern paperback book, etched with grooves or slots. In these grooves, small stone or metal counters called calculi, from which we get our word calculate, a wonderful little historical breadcrumb, were moved back and forth. The most common type was a grooved or pocket abacus. Imagine columns representing powers of 10 units, tens, hundreds, thousands, and so on. Let's do a little mental math on an imaginary Roman abacus. A vertical groove would have 4 calculi at the bottom and 1 calculus at the top. The top calculus would typically represent 5, like the V in Roman numerals representing 5 units, or 50 in the tens column, etc. And the 4 bottom calculi would represent units 1, 2, 3, 4. To represent a number like 7, you'd move the top calculus down for 5 and 2 bottom calculi up for 1 each, so 5 plus 1 equals 7. If you moved all 4 bottom calculi up and the top calculus down, that would make 9. To get 10, you'd clear that column and move 1 calculus in the next column to the left, the tens column. It's essentially a base 10 system for calculation, mimicking our decimal system without requiring explicit numbers. You can hear the gentle whisper "kashu, kashu" as the pebbles slide along the grooves. This tactile system was incredibly efficient for addition, subtraction, and even relatively complex multiplication and division, provided you had the skill. A practiced Roman accountant could perform calculations faster than a contemporary European, trying to do longhand sums on paper before Arabic numerals became common. This was precisely because the abacus separated the act of calculation from the difficulty of writing the number itself. You performed the sums using the pebbles, and then when you had the final answer, you'd convert it back into the more awkward Roman numerals to record it. It was like doing all your taxes on a powerful supercomputer, then writing the final number down in cursive with a quill and ink on a parchment scroll. A bit of a mismatch, but it worked. However, the abacus still had its limits. It excelled at numbers within human scale, allowing for sums that involved hundreds of thousands or even millions of units. But once you start approaching the scale of grains of sand on a beach, billions, trillions, and beyond the abacus, even a theoretically infinite one becomes unworkable. Imagine needing thousands upon thousands of columns for billions of pebbles. You'd need an abacus as wide as the Mediterranean Sea? The Roman abacus could easily handle the count of Roman citizens' millions, or the legions' tens of thousands, or the sestertii in the imperial treasury billions by our reckoning. But the sand problem pushed past its practical operational limits and into the realm of philosophical or even comedic impossibility. There is no groove on the abacus for infinity minus one, or for the uncountable number of particles in a nebula. Mainstream historical fact. While we associate the abacus with ancient China or Japan, the Roman abacus, or hand abacus, a more portable variant, was widely used across the Roman Empire for commercial transactions, financial record-keeping, and even for scientific calculations. It allowed Romans to perform complex arithmetic long before the adoption of Hindu-Arabic numerals, simplified written calculations. In fact, many common mathematical problems were typically solved by setting them up on an abacus and performing the operations with the calculi, then transcribing the result onto a written document if needed for records. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to the abacus is that some historical accounts suggest that wealthy Romans might even have commissioned ornate or jewel-encrusted abacuses made of precious metals, not just plain bronze. So you could have a gladiator making change with little gold pebbles while you calculate your vast riches on a mother-of-pearl studded abacus. One could almost imagine a Roman showing off their elaborate abacus the way a modern person shows off their expensive watch or smartphone. "Oh, this old thing, it's just my solid gold diamond-encrusted abacus. Helps me figure out how many more slaves I need to buy." Historians still argue whether the widespread use of the abacus for actual computation combined with the primary role of Roman numerals for recording hindered the theoretical development of written algorithms for large numbers in ancient Rome. Was the abacus too efficient, making true numerical abstraction less pressing? Or was it merely a pragmatic solution that fulfilled their existing needs perfectly well? Whatever the debate for our grains of sand question, the abacus offers a window into the computational limits of Roman thought. For practical, immense quantities, it was magnificent. For truly vast, conceptually overwhelming numbers, it became ironically a tiny instrument against a boundless ocean. It is perhaps this boundary, this philosophical impossibility, that led Romans to estimations, our next soft mental step. You're still drifting gently, your mental Roman abacus finally at rest, those little bronze calculi quiet in their grooves. We've established that for all its practical brilliance, the Roman abacus, like Roman numerals themselves, simply wasn't built for cosmic scale numbers, the kind of numbers you'd need if you truly intended to count every individual grain of sand on the sprawling shores of their vast Mediterranean Sea. That would have required an abacus the size of the empire itself, with columns stretching to the moon. So what did they do when facing quantities that were so vast, so ridiculously immense, that even attempting to count them was ludicrous, they estimated? And in many cases, a lot was more than sufficient. This wasn't an act of laziness, it was pure, unadulterated pragmatism. Imagine you're a Roman general standing on a hill overlooking a plain where a barbarian horde is gathering. Do you pull out your abacus and attempt to count each individual warrior's shield and angry axe-waving face? No. You take a swift look, perhaps dispatch some scouts for a closer and much riskier inspection, and you return with an estimate, "Commander, they number perhaps 50,000, or, "We face an uncountable host." You use terms that convey magnitude without demanding an exact, pixel-perfect census. If a Roman general's aide ever returned from reconnaissance and said, "Sir, I have counted every single hair on every single barbarian in the enemy force, and the total is precisely 7,893, 211, 947, 420, 000000000000000000000 hairs, give or take an eyelash. He would probably be immediately relieved of his duties, or sent to a sanitarium for having lost his senses possibly by trying to tally the untallyable. Just tell me if we have enough legionaries to fight them. Estimation wasn't just for battlefields. It was inherent in every large-scale aspect of Roman life where exact counts were impossible or irrelevant. Take the great Roman cities filled with bustling markets, towering tenements, and constant human movement. When referring to the sheer density of population in Rome, people didn't say, "There are exactly 1,003,287 residents and 4,921 stray dogs, give or take." They said the city teems with a countless multitude, or spoke in terms of the populous forum. When a devastating fire ripped through Rome, the reported damage wasn't quantified by individual destroyed tiles, but by the number of city blocks decimated, or the approximate number of homes lost. There's a delightful ease in not knowing every precise digit. If you're trying to catch every single raindrop in a bucket, you'll be there all day. It's far more practical to just say, "Oh, it's raining pretty heavily." Think of the vast quantities of water flowing through their famous aqueducts, a network of engineering marvels. They knew the flow rate, the volume of water delivered over time to various cisterns and fountains and bathhouses, measured in quinaria, a unit of flow. They understood they had enough water to sustain hundreds of thousands or even 1,000,000 people. But did they stand at the source, counting every single molecule of water, every single droplet making its way to Rome? Absolutely not. That's an absurd concept beyond practical, theoretical, or even imaginable needs. Similarly, they farmed on a massive scale. To provision a city the size of Rome or a marching army, immense amounts of grain were needed. While the grain might be weighed in sacks or measured in cubic modi at the granaries for record-keeping, nobody was sitting there counting every single grain of wheat. They simply dealt with large, practical units that conveyed enough, or too much, or not nearly enough. So how did they do these estimations? They relied on proportional reasoning and experience. If one field yields X amount of grain, 10 similar fields might yield 10X. If one boat can carry 100 amphorae, 10 boats can carry 1,000. It's a scaling-up principle familiar to us today, when we roughly guess how many people are in a crowd based on a small section. This involves what you might call back-of-the-tablet calculations, a sense of an intuitive multiplication. They used units like a jugful, a handful, a wagon load, a herd, a flock. These words are inherently vague but universally understood within context, a shortcut for huge numbers without writing out a string of M's with bars. Mainstream historical fact. While precise enumeration for specific purposes like the census or military roles was critical and meticulously attempted for natural phenomena or for quantities far beyond the human ability to count individually, Roman thinkers, like many ancients, readily embraced approximation and estimation. Early geographers and historians like Strabo, when describing populations or geographical features, would often use descriptive terms that conveyed vastness, for example, very many, immense, a multitude, rather than striving for specific empirically derived numerical values. It wasn't a flaw in their methodology. It was a pragmatic approach to data that could not and did not need to be precise. A quirky or fringe tidbit in the realm of estimation. Even some highly detailed Roman maps and land surveys known as grammatici, after their primary surveying tool, the gramma often focused on boundaries, features, and ownership in great detail, but large-scale acreage or precise topological features might still be rounded or estimated. Their emphasis was on pragmatic use, defining property lines for taxation, mapping out roads for military or trade routes, rather than an abstract GPS-level mapping accuracy for every undulation of the terrain or the precise square footage of a remote forest. It's like being incredibly precise about where your backyard ends, but then describing the Amazon rainforest as very, very large and green. It works for the immediate purpose. Historians still argue whether the Romans' general comfort with estimation, particularly for environmental resources, or vast natural quantities like the fish in the sea or the sand on a shore, signifies a philosophical distinction in how they perceived human control and understanding over the natural world versus an objective drive for empirical quantification seen in later eras, Some argue it speaks to their recognition of an unconquerable chaos beyond their immediate reach, while others suggest it simply reflects the technological limits of their age. Why try to count the fish when you can't even see them all, much less catch them? This practical mindset brings us right back to our original sand grains. If you can't meaningfully count them, you resort to a grand, almost spiritual acknowledgement of their infinite presence. The Roman attitude would likely have been, why are we talking about counting sand? Let's talk about where the next great military road is going. Or perhaps, I just hope I have enough sand for my mortar when building that new public bath. The precise number of grains in the universe won't help me if my plaster collapses. The immense, seemingly uncountable quantities they actually needed to manage for their empire-building project's logistics resources will be our focus as your thoughts slowly drift into sleep. Your mind might still be idly estimating crowd sizes or the amount of rain falling, those easy, forgiving "it's a lot" numbers settling deep. But let's bring it back to where the Roman genius truly shone, where they took a lot and made it actionable, tangible, and monumental: their engineering. When the Romans weren't building vast empires through military conquest, they were building colossal structures that stood for millennia, a testament to their practicality and, yes, their mastery of numbers. Numbers too big to count precisely but perfectly estimable for building the foundations of a civilization. These are not numbers of sand grains on a beach, but numbers of bricks, blocks, and barrels of cement. Imagine yourself as a Roman master builder responsible for the construction of a new aqueduct, snaking over valleys and through mountains, bringing fresh, clean water to Rome. This isn't just about elegant arches. It's about hundreds of miles of pipes and channels. You'd need tens of thousands of cubic meters of stone, millions of bricks, hundreds of thousands of tons of a revolutionary material, Roman concrete, opus caementicium. You couldn't, of course, count every pebble, every grain of pozzolanic ash that made up the cement, but you absolutely needed to know how many boatloads of aggregate, how many quarries would need to be excavated, and how many legions of laborers it would take to transport and lay it all. A slight miscalculation here wouldn't just mean an awkward error, it could mean the collapse of a structure, a massive waste of resources, or the tragic drowning of a town that relied on its water supply. That's real pressure enough to keep any ancient project manager awake at night. The Colosseum, that iconic symbol of Roman might, is a staggering example. Picture its immense scale. It could hold some 50,000 to 80,000 spectators, all in a complex tiered structure that was a masterpiece of design. To build this behemoth required an unfathomable quantity of materials, over 100,000 cubic meters of travertine marble alone, hauled from Tivoli, over 750,000 tons of it. Then there's the concrete, the bricks, the iron clamps. These numbers would stretch far beyond the thousands that were easily represented by M in their numbering system, needing the much larger, or at least a practical approximation in large units, as we discussed. This wasn't guesswork. It involved precise surveys, calculations of volume and weight, and meticulous logistical planning to ensure that enough raw materials arrived on site at the right time in the right quantities. It's construction management Roman style. And when you think about it, building the Colosseum needed way more organization than merely wondering about the sand in a single amphitheater. You needed to count stones, even if they were counted by the ton or by the cubic meter. Conquest also involved immense numbers in planning and logistics. The legions, those mighty fighting machines, could total hundreds of thousands, as we noted before. Think of Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul. Not only did he command tens of thousands of men, but he famously built bridges and fortifications at lightning speed. For example, he ordered a bridge built over the Rhine River in just 10 days. This wasn't an act of magic. It required incredible logistical calculations. How many trees need to be felled for the timbers? How many nails? How many sappers, engineers to build it? How many guards to protect them? And perhaps the greatest numerical challenge of all, how many bags of supplies, food, water, tools, weapons, did each soldier need multiplied by the thousands of soldiers for the hundreds of miles they marched across Europe? These numbers, while massive, were still bound by tangible units: a soldier, a loaf of bread, a spear, a beam of wood. The difficulty wasn't in conceptualizing the numbers, but in physically obtaining and moving the necessary resources. Mainstream historical fact: Roman engineering achievements, from their road networks stretching over 250,000 miles to their innovative concrete required an exceptional mastery of practical mathematics and estimations for large-scale material acquisition and project management. Their public works and military logistics demanded an understanding of immense quantities far beyond basic commerce, relying on the measurement of volumes, weights, and personnel in hundreds of thousands or even millions for successful execution. This highlights that while their numbering notation was cumbersome for abstract large numbers, their applied understanding of scale was highly developed. A quirky or fringe tidbit from Roman engineering. There's an account, perhaps apocryphal, of Roman generals when planning the invasion of an enemy territory or anticipating a lengthy siege, meticulously estimating the weight of water needed for their army for X days down to individual water skins, knowing that logistical failure would mean disaster. Or imagine an architect of the Pantheon, which features the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome, meticulously calculating the shifting loads and precise ratios of aggregates to create such a vast and enduring structure. No computer simulations, just empirical knowledge, precise observation, and an amazing intuitive understanding of how things add up literally. One minor numerical slip-up, and you have the largest concrete pancake in ancient history. You might picture the chief engineer staring at his notes, pulling his hair, trying to figure out if that last boatload of pozzolan ash was truly enough, or if they needed another 200 tons. Historians still argue whether the apparent lack of abstract theoretical mathematics in Roman scholarly output, especially compared to their Greek predecessors, implies a deficiency in their intellectual capacity, or if it simply points to their cultural preference for pragmatic applied solutions. Was their lack of cosmic counting merely a reflection of their immediate and urgent imperial needs? Perhaps a Roman engineer designing a massive arch never concerned himself with the number of atoms in a cubic meter of travertine, only with how many cubic meters were needed to complete his magnificent structure, ensuring its stability for centuries to come. As your eyelids grow heavier, imagine the steady chipping of Roman chisels on stone, the pouring of wet concrete, and the marching feet of legionaries. These real-world colossal numbers, though not of sand, whisper of imperial might, and they required calculations that might have pushed even our modern computing systems without a digital calculator for the busy engineers of Rome. And our next numerical adventure dives into where many of these calculations ultimately came from taxes and census. You're perhaps envisioning colossal Roman structures rising from the dust, the steady clink of chisels, and the murmur of thousands of laborers' numbers accumulating not in sand grains but in cubic tons of stone and timber. While grand engineering demanded vast calculations, perhaps the most relentless and universal source of immense numbers in Rome wasn't from military campaigns or monumental building projects, but from the unyielding engine of every great empire: taxes, censuses, and meticulously kept records. No amount of poetic abstraction could avoid the need to count money or people when the government was involved. Even in your sleepy haze, the drone of bureaucracy can often cut through. Think of yourself as a Roman citizen, perhaps a humble farmer in Campania. Every 5 years, the censors would conduct a detailed census, a comprehensive headcount and assessment of property, livestock, and assets. This wasn't just a simple tick-box exercise. This was serious. It determined your social standing, your eligibility for military service, and most importantly, your tax obligations. Imagine hordes of scribes and officials fanning out across the vast Roman territory, from the sun-drenched vineyards of Italy to the foggy reaches of Britain, painstakingly collecting data. Each family, each slave, each plot of land, each head of cattle, each jug of olive oil produced, all of it had to be noted, aggregated, and compiled. My goodness, the sheer scale of the administrative overhead. We're talking about potentially hundreds of millions of individual data points being funneled back to central repositories in Rome, all handled without databases, cloud storage, or even robust filing cabinets as we know them. They just had very diligent scribes, thousands of wax tablets, and vast quantities of papyrus. One cheeky tidbit: there are actual ancient jokes about corrupt tax collectors using slightly too small weighing scales or deliberately miscounting one's livestock. Human nature truly timeless. This immense raw data gathered from every corner of the empire was crucial for assessing tributum tribute, a general tax, customs duties portorium, and land taxes tributum soli. The imperial treasury was not dealing in single sestertii. It was dealing in sums that reached into the tens and then hundreds of millions and even billions by our modern monetary standards, adjusting for inflation and purchasing power. While the value of money fluctuates wildly through history, 1 billion sestertii was a truly massive sum for the Roman treasury, enough to fund legions or construct massive public works. These enormous sums needed to be meticulously accounted for, tracked through different departments and presented to the emperor and the Senate. You can picture vast ledger scrolls filled with Roman numerals, the totals probably reaching beyond the M for millions was conceptually there. Remember the M symbol, although still clumsy for calculation without the abacus. The state itself was a monumental bureaucracy. Armies of civil servants, scribes, accountants, and administrators labored tirelessly to manage the complexities of such a vast empire. They kept detailed registers of births, deaths, citizens, veterans, land deeds, legal rulings, military provisions, and so much more. This record-keeping wasn't merely academic. It was the sinews that held the empire together. Without accurate counts and records, how could they ensure justice, distribute food, manage the vast road network, or equip a fighting force? Each of these tasks generated massive quantities of numerical data, necessitating a sophisticated administrative system. Think of the state granaries, which supplied Rome's 1 million-plus citizens with subsidized grain, often a significant political lever to ensure peace and quell unrest. Knowing precisely how much grain was available and how much was needed on a day-by-day or week-by-week basis required impeccable numerical oversight. A logistical error there could literally mean starvation and revolt. Mainstream historical fact. The Roman Empire at its peak supported a population estimated to be between 50 and 90 million people. Managing taxation and conscription across such a vast population and territory necessitated a remarkably extensive and sophisticated system of administrative record-keeping, often using multiple layers of officials and registers, reflecting a significant ability to handle large numerical data. This was arguably one of the most bureaucratically advanced societies of the ancient world. The very word fiscal comes from the Roman fiscus, the public treasury or chest where money was kept. A quirky tidbit that underscores their dedication to detailed record-keeping. The Roman authorities were incredibly pedantic about documenting boundaries and properties. Land surveys conducted by professionals known as agrimensores produced maps and textual descriptions that were so precise they sometimes included the location of individual trees or stones used as markers. This level of detail, especially when aggregated over millions of parcels of land across the empire, resulted in a truly enormous amount of numerical data, numbers of measurements, acres, boundaries, and in effect property grains of land. Can you imagine the tedious but crucial job of writing down where each and every one of these millions of trees and stones was located? To the third cypress tree thence by the rock shaped like a disgruntled bear? Historians still argue whether the efficiency of Roman administrative systems, particularly in their ability to manage colossal populations and revenue streams, indicates a level of statistical understanding akin to early modern concepts, or if it was more a testament to sheer human effort, the practical utility of the abacus and the organizational structure of their imperial bureaucracy, overriding the need for sophisticated numerical theories. Was it an early form of big data management without the benefit of computing power, or simply the sum of millions of painstaking individual calculations? No matter how you look at it, the Romans did manage vast numbers of real people, real property, and real money. These numbers, unlike the mythical grains of sand on a cosmic beach, had real consequences if miscounted. Your tax bill, your military service, and your supper relied on them. As you drift deeper into the past, leaving behind the realm of administrative detail, we'll shift gears from concrete numbers to the metaphorical realm where sand itself became a powerful symbol. The sounds of the Roman imperial counting houses have begun to fade, the whispers of weary scribes poring over endless ledgers, receding into the distant hum of bureaucracy. You've heard how Rome wrestled with immense numbers for taxes, citizens, and massive building projects, practical, tangible quantities that profoundly shaped their world. But our journey started with sand, not just as a physical challenge for ancient numerologists, but as a metaphor for the truly, utterly, and hopelessly uncountable. And in ancient Rome, as in many civilizations, sand held a deep, rich significance beyond its granular reality, appearing frequently in literature and rhetoric, as a symbol of immense, unfathomable multitude. Imagine yourself on a Roman beach once more, not counting grains now, but simply observing the endless sweep of the shore. The sheer quantity, the impossible totality, instantly evokes a sense of infinite bounty or overwhelming force. This sensory experience translated beautifully into words. Roman poets and rhetoricians well versed in the classics drew deeply from Greek and even earlier Near Eastern traditions where sand of the sea was a recurring trope for an uncountable blessed or cursed multitude. It became shorthand. When Virgil, the great Roman poet, describes the countless souls of the underworld or the myriad descendants of Aeneas, he doesn't use complex numbers. He invokes the sand, the stars, the leaves of trees. These comparisons weren't meant to be mathematically precise. They were meant to stir the imagination to convey an emotion, wonder, fear, awe, or despair at the sheer volume of something. It was poetic license, a shorthand for numbers too large to be properly named. Consider a famous Roman literary passage when an orator wished to emphasize the incredible vastness of a city's population, or the legions of an opposing army. They wouldn't rattle off a complex series of M's and vinculum-enhanced numbers. They would often say the number was as the sands of the sea or as many as the stars in the heavens. This communicated an abstract, almost overwhelming scale more effectively than any attempt at numerical precision. It implies an overwhelming multitude and immensity that beggars human attempts at quantification. One amusing thought that might float through your sleepy mind: if a Roman poet genuinely tried to write an epic poem where every time he described a multitude, he tried to insert the actual number of elements instead of sands, the poem would quickly become an incomprehensible statistical report. A force of X 100,000 men marched against the enemy whose cavalry numbered X plus Y thousands. Not quite the ring of classical verse. Beyond poetic flourishes, the metaphor of sand also appeared in Roman philosophy, and even in casual speech when people simply wished to convey an awful lot of something. A Roman friend might complain, "I have to deal with a sand count of errands today," implying a truly overwhelming and seemingly endless list of chores. It conveyed a feeling of endlessness, a lack of discrete boundaries, much like actual sand. Sand as an analogy was versatile. It could represent infinite wealth, gold as sand, endless descendants as promised to Abraham in Judeo-Christian texts, a concept that filtered through the wider classical world, or simply the crushing number of problems facing an individual. It often served as a marker of the human condition facing the vastness of nature or fate. Mainstream historical fact. The use of natural uncountable quantities like sand, stars, or drops of water as metaphors for immense or innumerable quantities was a pervasive literary and rhetorical device throughout classical antiquity, adopted by Roman writers and orators from earlier Greek and Semitic traditions. It allowed for the conveyance of awe-inspiring or overwhelming scale without the need for numerical specificity, illustrating a philosophical and artistic engagement with concepts of infinity. It effectively served as a kind of ancient poetic big number shortcut. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this symbolism: there are rare Roman or Hellenistic astrological texts that mention counting the stars not for poetic effect, but as a practical, if impossibly challenging method of foretelling fate or observing cosmic patterns. These ancient stargazers often developed incredibly complex conceptual frameworks and systems for classifying astronomical bodies, sometimes extending into numerical values far beyond what was needed for daily navigation. They didn't literally count every single one, but they conceptually pushed their number systems to hold thousands of star names or celestial bodies, suggesting a practical limit of their uncountable. These are, however, more aligned with philosophical inquiries into celestial mechanics rather than census-taking. The idea of truly knowing the cosmos by meticulously counting its components, even on the fringes of Roman thought, must have felt like a beautifully absurd and exhausting endeavor. Imagine a Roman astrologer trying to assign a precise Roman numeral to every star in the visible galaxy. You might need a quill dipped in eternal ink. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of such numerical metaphors in Roman literature demonstrates a fundamental comfort with large, abstract but imprecise quantities, or if it indicates a cultural resistance to grappling with actual statistical or theoretical infinities in a numerical sense, preferring descriptive flourish over mathematical exactitude. Perhaps for them, the artistic impression of vastness was simply more important and culturally valued than trying to force numbers where they didn't belong. The beauty of the metaphor wasn't in its truthfulness to mathematics, but its truthfulness to the human experience of being dwarfed by scale. As your eyelids grow heavy and your breathing slows, imagine those soft sands stretching endlessly before you, A calming vast canvas silent in its silent, uncountable glory, a gentle hum at the very edges of existence, just a tiny bit beyond any practical need for numbers. The concept of counting sand now shifts focus once again to the very pioneers of abstract numeric thought far outside Rome's pragmatic sphere.